He has again touted electronic filing. Hope you all did that. If you filed electronically and if you had a refund coming to you and you had it deposited electronically to your account, it was there in 3 days.
Wow, that's incredible. That's great.
It's absolutely true.
And that actually worked?
It worked well.
Good.
People loved it. More and more people, including senior citizens, are filing electronically. We were afraid that there would be a little resistance, but the numbers are up. People are happy. Paper filers are going to have to wait a little bit longer for their refunds just because if you've never seen the Comptroller's Office during tax season, you ought to see it. I could not even imagine the volume of mail. You can't even imagine. And so much of that has to be sorted by hand and the checks pulled out and the staples and paper clips taken off and not to mention the beginning of the audit. Yeah.
With all the automation, it's still, though, there's some manual activity going on.
Absolutely.
Do you have an idea about what the percentage of each is now? How much of the total comes in electronically versus?
I don't know it, but I know that our electronic numbers were up again even from last year. So that's a good thing. We're definitely going in that trend.
Good.
And you know, we'd like to see 100% electronic filing.
Well, I got mine back. I filed the old-fashioned way, but I've already got mine back.
Yeah, but you.
And unlike our friends in California, they got IOUs back.
And Hawaii, I understand, is terrible.
Yeah. So thank the comptroller for my check. I appreciate that.
And many people do. As we go out and around, and he likes to go out and visit the local offices. I was in Upper Marlboro with him. I guess it was the 13th or the 14th, right before the tax deadline. And there were a number of local constituents in getting their free help at the local offices. Loved the help. The staff is working really hard, but they're doing a good job.
How about jumping to something else, like we were talking earlier about the campaigns? How about the governors? How about O'Malley and Ehrlich? What do you think about that? Where are you on it? You know, who looks like a winner? Or is the comptroller going to lead you over to his supporting him for governor?
The comptroller is definitely running for comptroller.
Okay,
period.
so take him out. Now it's between Ehrlich and O'Malley, and you know, where are you? Tell me why.
I am not surprised Ehrlich jumped in, and that's because I think if there were ever a year for a Republican, there is this anti-incumbent sentiment nationally. Whether the incumbent's a Democrat or Republican, but with the anti-incumbent sentiment, with the horrible economy that O'Malley has been saddled with, not through his own fault, but it's been a very difficult 4 years. I see Ehrlich being encouraged by all of that and doing it, so I'm not surprised that he's running. I still think it's a long uphill battle for a Republican in Maryland, despite all the recent events.
So
I still
you
think
really
O'Malley,
say O'Malley wins?
I think so.
What do you think,
I think
Mayor?
you know, I've been impressed with this administration's willingness to tackle some long-term problems that have been there for a generation, and really, you know, I think he's right. I mean, he started in the hole and he's climbing out, but I think they're doing it the right way, and in terms of trying to contain costs, you know, contain spending, and trying to be as creative as they can in terms of revenue sources. You know, I got to say, as an observer, even though this last legislative session was not particularly kind, I do think the governor's on the right track in terms of moving the state. I said we got some good numbers this week, I think, when they were talking about the number of jobs created versus the number of jobs lost. And although we still got big problems with foreclosures, and I think there's another bubble that's going to blow, and that's going to be the commercial property. I don't know if it'll be nearly as bad as the residential bubble, but all things said, I've been impressed with so far with the way that the governor's handled the challenges that he's got, and you know, my sense is most of the folks will probably look at that as objectively as possible, and I think he gets another shot.
I think that according to one of the polls I looked at, O'Malley has 46%, Ehrlich 40%, and that's the same numbers, about the same numbers they had when they went at it before. What do you think, Len?
It's going to be a close race, and a lot of it will depend on what's going on nationally, only because Ehrlich has a very simple message. He raised your taxes and I didn't. And to the uninformed, that's a very compelling message. Now, you could say, well, O'Malley was left with a terrible budget gap that Ehrlich gave him, that Ehrlich raised spending 33%. O'Malley has cut spending, that Ehrlich raised fees, but I'm not sure the public will listen to all that.
Sure.
And so it'll be a close race, but it's really tough to beat a Democrat in the state, especially a very clever and smart Democrat like Governor O'Malley.
And well-funded.
Right.
Yeah, that's the other thing, as we didn't talk about before. It's my understanding that he's been very successful in raising funds in anticipation of it. You know, the one thing, I was talking with some folks this week, that, you know, the O'Malley decision to jump into the gubernatorial race, I think is understandable, somewhat predictable. But I had talked to some people that were really anticipating that he was going to jump in the race against Mikulski for the U.S. Senate seat, largely because of the fervor that you talked about earlier. About the Pew Research released some numbers this week that says the Congress of the United States gets an approval rating in the single digits. So I think you could have made a good argument for him to consider jumping. I don't know that they would have been terribly successful, but it might have been an interesting challenge.
All right, how about one of the great political contests in the history of our county, with the county executive's job, with the demise of Jack Johnson? What do you think of that? And what do you think about all of the players? And maybe if you'd rate the players like chance or no chance, or who's going to come out on top. Mayor, go ahead, start with you.
Well, I would think, you know, to most observers, if you put candidates on tiers, it's my gathering is that Mr. Baker and Sheriff Jackson are probably on tier 1. I think Jaron Levi and maybe a couple others might be on their tier 2. Everybody else is on tier 3. But there's like 9 or 10 candidates so far, either announced or pending announcement.
Do you want to tell us who's going to win?
I think it's going to come down to one of those two, and it depends on who gets their vote out. I mean, it's obvious that if the past is an indicator of the future, Mr. Baker will do well in the central area of the county, and probably, you know, on the fringes of the south and the north, and probably up north, and Mr. Jackson will do well in the south and probably inside the Beltway. So I think it could be a fairly close race. The scuttlebutt is that Mr. Johnson's organization is shifting over to help the sheriff. So I don't know how that impacts, but I think it's going to be a spirited race, because both of the top 2 guys have run countywide elections. They have good name recognition. They have good money, and they're both competent people. So I think it's going to be a challenging race for them, and perhaps the potential outsider is Jaron Levi.
What about the fact that Rushern Baker has been beaten twice by Jack Johnson, and the demographics that Johnson won from, the demographic areas that he came out of, there were more people there, more voters there than Rushern had, and you nailed it as you go north, College Park, Laurel, Bowie, places like that Rushern should do well in, but he still got beat. But and if you look at you said the Beltway, look at the Beltway south of it, and you find if you look at those precincts, Rushern I think won the 47th precinct, which is his own, and that's not Beltway, that was Chevrolet Plus. What do you think, Glenn?
Well, I mean, it was a close race 4 years ago. Less than 6%, just a few thousand votes. And since then, Baker hasn't stopped running. He's been pretty much a full-time candidate since then. He's kept his organization going. He's had a paid staff going. And so the campaign never really ended. So that's a good base to start from.
What about money? I believe that he lost before, and his people claimed he didn't have enough money to really run in the race countywide.